The Flannan Isles are a small, uninhabited island group in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, more than 17 nautical miles or 32 kilometers west of the Isle of Lewis in the stormy and unforgiving seas of the North Atlantic. The islands are known as the Seven Hunters, and for good reason. For hundreds of years, this small and rocky island chain was notorious for sinking ships destined for Scotland, sending countless souls to their deaths in the cold and black depths surrounding these lonely isles. In 1895, construction of a new lighthouse began on Isle Moor, one of the Flannan Isles, and on December 7, 1899, this lighthouse was lit for the first time. Just over a year later, however, the light at Isle Moor went out, and the three men serving as lighthouse keepers? Well, they mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen again. The seas of the North Atlantic are known for their frigid and stormy demeanor, and the men and women who dare venture out onto them have always been keenly aware that they were taking their lives in their own hands by doing so. In such waters, death is never more than a single misstep or unexpected and sudden weather change away. It was around midnight on December 15, 1900, when the transatlantic steamer Arctur was passing by the Flannan Isles on its voyage from Philadelphia to the port of Leith in Scotland. The weather had grown progressively rough that day as the steamer approached the Flannan Isles, and the captain was surprised to find that the beacon of the lighthouse was not lit as they made their way by. Reports from the Isle of Lewis, 16 miles away, confirmed that no light was seen from the lighthouse at all starting on December 15th. Strangely, it was more than 10 days later, on December 26, that a lighthouse relief tender ship, the Hesperus, arrived at Isle Moor on a routine trip to reprovision the island and deliver assistant lighthouse keeper Joseph Moore. Moore was returning from shore duty and was anticipating rejoining his comrades. When the Hesperus arrived on the afternoon of the 26th, the captain, Jim Harvey, sounded his horn and sent up flare rockets to alert the island that relief had arrived. But they were met with silence. Nobody had come to the landing to receive them. In fact, nobody could be seen on the island at all. Not only had none of the keepers come to greet the relief ship at the landing, but there was no flag on the flagstaff, and no provision boxes left out for them, which was customary. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, was familiar with the island and the lighthouse. A boat was lowered from the tender ship, and he went alone to investigate the strangeness of the situation, while the others waited anxiously aboard the Hesperus. Upon making his landing, Moore climbed the 160 slippery and difficult steps up to the lighthouse, noting at one point that 3 giant black birds were perched on the cliffs above him, watching his progress as he climbed higher and higher. Moore half expected to find the other keepers at work or otherwise occupied, even though it was strange that none of them had come to welcome the relief ship. But, as he reached the small lighthouse compound, he quickly realized that something was very, very wrong. The island was abandoned. The lighthouse at Isle Moor was operated and maintained by 3 men at the time: James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, the occasional or substitute. MacArthur was filling in for a 4th man, William Ross, who had left the island on sick leave. They were all experienced and skilled men, familiar with the hazards of working in such isolated and hazardous conditions. James Ducat had more than 22 years of experience as a lighthouse keeper, and was well respected by those who knew him as capable and reliable. But when Joseph Moore arrived at the small lighthouse compound, he found that the men seemed to have vanished without a trace. The door and gate to the station were both closed, and there was no one to be seen. Making his way through the deserted station compound, what he found only troubled him more and more with every step. The clocks had all stopped. The fire had not been lit for days, despite the frigid December air that would drop to nearly freezing during the nights. The beds were empty and unmade, just as they had been left in the early morning before the disappearance. When he entered the common areas, He found the table set with food for a meal that had not been eaten, and a chair lay overturned nearby. In the light room of the lighthouse, he found everything looked to be in proper order. The lamp was cleaned, the fuel fountain was filled, and there were even blinds on the windows. Everything was as he would expect it to be, just waiting for the keepers to return and light the beacon. Joseph Moore later reported that he had felt a very strange and eerie feeling as he walked through the deserted lighthouse, and that, from that moment on, the island had an overwhelming sense of melancholy. Now, these were hard men. These were men who lived every day with the knowledge that they were alone and isolated on this rocky island. If anything happened, it might be a week or more before help arrived. So, for Moore to have such an uneasy feeling, and to go so far as to include that in his report, is saying something. Joseph Moore rushed back to alert the Hesperus of what he had found, and the captain sent one of the sailors to help him continue his search of the station. The two men made a thorough search but couldn't find a hint of what had become of the 3 lighthouse keepers. Finally, they returned to the ship, empty-handed and more than a little bewildered. Jim Harvey, the captain of the Hesperus, told Moore that he was going to have to return to the island to keep the light going, and called for volunteers from his crew to help with this, so as not to leave him there all by himself. 3 of the crew offered their services and returned with him to the lighthouse, while Captain Harvey returned immediately to Brestclete to send an urgent telegraph to the Northern Lighthouse Board, who was responsible for operating and maintaining the stations. The men who remained on the island continued their search for the missing lighthouse keepers. Normally, lighthouse status updates at the time were written on slate, small chalkboards, throughout the day and transferred to a logbook each night. And the men found entries made by James Ducat, the principal keeper, on the slate on the morning of December 15th, evidence that nothing seemed to be amiss at that point. This meant that whatever terrible event had occurred had happened at some point that day, since the steamer that had initially discovered the unlit lighthouse had passed by later that night. Over the next 2 days, Joseph Moore and the 3 crewmen made a thorough search over and around the island, but without much success. Whatever had happened to the missing lighthouse keepers was still eluding their best efforts. A few days later, they were joined by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the NLB, who was desperate to find answers. In the days that followed, Muirhead and the others tried to piece together what might have happened to the missing lighthouse keepers, but without much to go on. The eastern landing, where they had come ashore, appeared perfectly normal, with nothing out of place. But when they extended their search to the western landing on the windward side of the island, it was a completely different story. The western landing and the entire area had been violently destroyed. There was a storage box halfway up the railway that was used to store landing ropes and tackle, and they found it missing entirely, its contents strewn all over the rocky area. This storage locker was secured in a crevice more than 100 feet above sea level, far beyond what any seas might be expected to reach, even in the worst of weather. The iron railings that connected the footpath to the tramway, which was used to transport supplies from the landing to the lighthouse, were torn from their foundations and twisted apart, and the handrail used to tie off boats to the landing was missing entirely. Even a huge boulder, weighing more than a ton, had been dislodged from its position high above sea level and left on the concrete path below. During their search of the lighthouse buildings, 2 sets of oilskins, heavy weather gear used to protect the men from the elements, were missing. But a 3rd set, belonging to James Ducat, the principal lighthouse keeper, was strangely still present. This made no sense. If the weather was severe enough that Marshall and MacArthur needed their heavy weather gear, why then would Ducat, a man who was highly experienced and knew the dangers of the island, go out into such weather in only his shirt sleeves? Initial theories were that the men were somehow swept away in a fierce storm, but there are problems with this. Firstly, we know that everything must have been fine on the island as of the morning of December 15th, since it appears that the routine duties of the keepers were being attended to as usual. According to the logbook, James Ducat noted that the days leading up to the disappearance found the island beset by fierce storms and terrible winds, the likes of which had never been seen before. He even wrote that the men were unusually quiet and pensive during the furious weather, and that MacArthur, a burly and rough man known to be violent and quick to anger, was openly weeping. The final entry in the logbook from December 15th noted that the storm had passed, and all was now calm. But there were no reports of storms in the area in the days leading up to the disappearance by anyone, and some believe that the log entries may have been forged or fabricated entirely. Even if there had, in fact, been a fearsome storm in the days prior to the 15th, Ducat noted that it had passed, and that all was now calm. Why then would two of the men have needed their oilskins? Also, if they were heading out to check on the extent of the damage by these storms, why would they have waited until the afternoon of the 15th to do it, when the winter sun would have been setting in the early afternoon and darkness was rapidly approaching? The short answer is, they probably wouldn't have. No mention of damage to the western landing or any injuries to the men had been recorded in the logbook, so it wasn't likely that the mysterious and unconfirmed storm that Ducat had written about had anything to do with the disappearances. So what happened? Well, the official story was that Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur must have gone down to the western landing to inspect the damage from the storm and secure the storage box containing the mooring equipment. It was concluded that they must have been caught by surprise by an unexpectedly large and freak wave, which then swept them out to sea and to their deaths. But there's more to the story. You see, the commissioners of the NLB had appointed Roderick Mackenzie, a gamekeeper on the nearby Isle of Lewis, to watch daily for signals from the lighthouse with the help of his two sons, to monitor and ensure that all was well. It was a safety net that was supposed to give an early warning if the light went out on Eileen Moor. But it didn't work. When Mackenzie's sons were questioned following the disappearance of the three men, Superintendent Muirhead discovered to his shock that no signal had been seen by them, even with the help of a powerful telescope, since December 7th, the date of the previous relief change, and a full 8 days before the Arctur made its way past the darkened lighthouse that fateful night on the 15th. Sure, sometimes it was difficult to see the signal from the Isle of Lewis for a few days at a time, depending on conditions. But this means that it had been more than a week that no lighthouse signal was lit by the time it was noticed by the passing steamship. If this was the case, why would Ducat's logs continue up through the morning of December 15th like nothing was wrong, aside from the phantom storm that had not been reported by anyone else in the area? This just doesn't add up. And the locals of the Outer Hebrides weren't satisfied either. Theories began to pop up everywhere. Some spoke of an eldritch creature rising up from the depths of the ocean to devour the unsuspecting men. Others whispered of a skeletal crew of the legendary ghost ship known as the Phantom of the Seven Hunters, visiting horror and death upon the men in the dark of night. There were even rumors that they might have been captured by foreign spies, or that some unknown and terrible threat drove them from the island in a desperate flight, only to be swept out to sea and lost forever. Rogue waves and sudden wind gusts strong enough to blow the men over the 300-foot cliff only 30 feet away from their perimeter wall are perhaps more likely than phantoms from beyond the grave. But who can say for sure? One of the more believable of these theories is also somehow more disturbing. That Donald MacArthur, a menacing and intimidating man with a foul temperament and a proclivity for violence, murdered the other two men and then threw himself from the cliffs afterwards. It was said that MacArthur detested and resented his posting on the isolated island of Eileen Moor, and this, coupled with being confined in such close quarters with Ducat and Marshall under stressful conditions, was enough to potentially strike the spark that ended in their deaths. Whatever their ultimate fate, we do know that their loss was a tragedy that has remained an undying and unresolved mystery for more than 120 years. We may never know the truth behind the missing lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Isles, but their loss was felt deeply by those who knew them. As Robert Muirhead wrote in his official report on January 8, 1901, I visited Flannan Isles when the relief was made so lately as 7th December, and have the melancholy recollection that I was the last person to shake hands with them and bid them adieu. Thanks for spending time with me today. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment below. It really helps out the channel. And if you have any stories that you'd like to see covered here, please let us know. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.